My cousin seduced every boyfriend I ever brought home for the holidays, so I brought an ex-convict to Thanksgiving and watched her entire world fall apart. Vanessa's hand was on his chest before the turkey even hit the table. I watched it happen from 6 feet away, holding a bowl of green beans I never got to set down. Michael didn't move her hand. He didn't need to. He just looked at her, said something too quiet for me to hear, and stepped back toward me like he was returning to safety. My mother was pouring wine like nothing was wrong. My grandmother was telling a story about her hip replacement, and my cousin, in a dress built for a nightclub, was standing in my parents' dining room recalibrating her approach in real time, because for once, it hadn't worked. I set the green beans down harder than I meant to, hard enough that a few of them bounced onto the tablecloth. Jessica caught my eye from across the table and gave me a look I'd never seen her wear before. Not pity, something closer to fear. My grandmother kept talking about her hip, oblivious, gesturing with a fork. Somewhere behind me, the television murmured a football score nobody was tracking. "You okay?" Michael asked, low, just for me, his hand finding the small of my back for half a second before dropping away again. "I'm better than okay," I said, and I meant it, because for the first time in 11 years, I was watching Vanessa lose, right there in my mother's dining room, in front of a green bean casserole and a bottle of wine she hadn't finished pouring. She recovered fast. She always did. She laughed too loud at something my uncle said, tossed her hair, glanced at Michael again like she was recalculating the angle of attack. I'd seen this exact sequence with Julian. I'd seen it with Trevor. I knew what came next. The cornering, the touch, the whisper that would end whatever I'd built. I braced for it the way you brace for weather you've lived through before. I didn't know yet that this time someone was recording. I grew up 20 minutes from every relative I have. My mother's side of the family settled in and around Canton, Ohio, 3 generations deep, and holidays weren't optional. You showed up, or you heard about it from my grandmother for the next 6 months, delivered secondhand through my mother, who always softened it just enough to still sting. My grandmother Eleanor ran that family like a small, well-funded monarchy. She had opinions about everyone's weight, marriage prospects, and career choices, and she delivered them at full volume over mashed potatoes. Vanessa was 2 years younger than me, my Aunt Carol's daughter, and from the time we were kids, she was positioned as the family's crown jewel. Blonde, where I was brown-haired, effortlessly thin, where I had to work for it. Funny in the loud, performative way that made rooms turn toward her. My grandmother called her a real showstopper before Vanessa had even hit puberty. Nobody ever called me that. I got sweet and smart, which even at 12 years old I understood were consolation prizes. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because the version of this story where I'm simply the wronged party isn't the whole truth. For years, I told myself Vanessa's behavior was just her personality, that she couldn't help how she was wired, that I was overreacting. I made excuses for her the same way my family did. It took me a long time to stop doing that. So some of what happened to me, I let happen, because I didn't want to be the difficult one. I didn't want to be the cousin who caused a scene at Thanksgiving. I was 23 the first time I understood what Vanessa actually was. I'd been dating a guy named Julian for 4 months. He was sweet in an unremarkable way, worked at a credit union in Massillon, drove a Honda Civic with a bobblehead dog on the dash, texted me good morning every day without fail. Nothing spectacular, but steady, and I liked steady. I brought him to Thanksgiving at my parents' house on Route 62, the same house I grew up in, the same table we'd used since I was 6. Vanessa showed up 40 minutes late in a black dress that belonged at a club, not a family dinner with green bean casserole and a football game on mute in the background. She sat down next to Julian before I could claim the seat myself. Within 20 minutes, her leg was pressed against his under the table. I know because I saw it when she shifted. She touched his arm every time he made a joke, even the unfunny ones. By the time dessert came around, I'd lost track of how many times she'd laughed with her hand resting somewhere on him. I found them in the kitchen around 9. Her hand was flat against his chest, her voice low, syrupy, telling him something about how some people just don't appreciate what they have. Julian looked uncomfortable, but he wasn't leaving. I said nothing. I just turned around and went back to the living room and sat with my mother's cousin Rhonda, who was talking about her knee surgery, and let the anger sit in my stomach like a stone. Julian and I broke up 3 weeks later. He said things weren't working, that he needed space. All the vague language men use when they don't want to name the real reason. 2 months after that, I saw a photo online. Him and Vanessa at a bar in Akron, her arm looped through his, both of them smiling like they'd never met me at all. I brought this to my mother. I told her what I'd seen at Thanksgiving, what I'd found in the kitchen. My mother, Diane, who has spent her entire adult life smoothing over conflict so nobody has to feel the discomfort of it, told me Vanessa didn't mean anything by it, that she was just affectionate, that I shouldn't make a whole thing out of it. My grandmother, when I brought it up at Christmas that same year, told me I should try being more feminine if I wanted to keep a man. She said it while eating a piece of pie, like it cost her nothing. That was the first time I understood the shape of the trap. It wasn't just Vanessa. It was the whole architecture around her. A family that had decided, collectively and without ever saying it out loud, that Vanessa's behavior was simply weather. Something that happened to you, not something she did. I should tell you about the incident that, looking back, explained everything that came after, though I didn't understand it at the time. When Vanessa was 16 and I was 18, she stole a boy from her own best friend, a girl named Priya, who'd been sleeping over at our grandmother's house for a summer week. Priya cried in the upstairs bathroom for an hour while Vanessa sat sat downstairs on the porch swing with the boy, laughing, utterly unbothered. When Priya finally came down, red-eyed, mascara streaked to her jaw, Vanessa told her she was being dramatic, and that he obviously wasn't that into her if this is how easy it was. Priya stopped coming around after that summer. She sent Vanessa a long message a few weeks later. I saw it once, before it got deleted, because Vanessa had shown it to me like a trophy, laughing at how unhinged it sounded. It wasn't unhinged. It was a 16-year-old girl asking, plainly, why her best friend had done that to her. Vanessa never answered it. Nobody in the family ever mentioned Priya again, as if she'd been erased for the crime of being embarrassed in front of Vanessa, while Vanessa herself simply moved on to the next room, the next audience, without a backward glance. I asked my grandmother once, years later, whatever happened to Priya? My grandmother waved a hand like she was swatting a fly. Oh, who knows, she said. Girls fall out of touch. As if an entire friendship hadn't been sacrificed on a porch swing so Vanessa could prove, to no one in particular, that she could take anything she wanted from anyone who loved her. I filed that memory away without understanding what it meant. Vanessa wasn't chasing men because she loved chaos, or because she was simply flirtatious, the way my mother liked to frame it. Vanessa needed to win. Specifically, she needed to win against people close to her, people whose loss would register, whose pain she could witness up close. A stranger's boyfriend wouldn't have interested her at all. It had to be someone whose devastation she could watch happen in real time, in a room she controlled, at a dinner she'd already claimed as her stage. After Julian, the pattern repeated itself with a predictability that would have been almost funny if it weren't destroying me one relationship at a time. I dated a guy named Marcus for 5 months the following spring, and never brought him to a single family function, and we lasted the full 5 months without incident, which I noted even then, though I told myself it was a coincidence. I dated a man named Derek for 8 months after that, and, testing a theory I hadn't fully admitted to myself, kept him away from every holiday, every backyard barbecue, every gathering where Vanessa might be present. That relationship also survived intact until it ended for its own unrelated reasons. Derek took a job in Columbus, and we tried long distance for 6 weeks before admitting it wasn't working. Nothing to do with any cousin at all. My best friend Amanda, who I'd known since Jackson High School, was the first person outside the family to notice the pattern out loud. We were at her kitchen table in the spring I was 26, splitting a bottle of wine, when she asked, point blank, why I'd never once brought Derek to meet my family in 8 full months of dating him. You do this every time, she said. You disappear for the holidays and come back like you survived something, and you never bring anyone home unless it's someone new, and then a few months later they're gone, and you never talk about why. I told her about Julian. I told her about the kitchen, the hand on his chest, the photo online 2 months later. Amanda's face went very still. That's not a coincidence, she said. That's a pattern, and your family is letting it happen. I remember laughing it off at the time, telling her she was overreacting, using the exact language my mother and grandmother had used on me. It took me another 2 years to understand that Amanda had been right, and that I'd defended my family to my best friend using the very words they'd used to silence me. I want to be clear that I noticed the pattern long before Amanda named it. I noticed it, and I still, for years, kept giving my family the benefit of the doubt, because that's what you do when the people hurting you are also the people who taught you what love was supposed to look like. Then I met Trevor. Trevor was a hospitalist at Altman Hospital, 31 years old, funny in a dry, understated way that took people a few weeks to warm up to. We dated for 7 months, longer than anyone before him, and it was the healthiest relationship of my adult life up to that point. He remembered small things. He asked good questions. He didn't flinch when I told him, 3 weeks before Christmas, the entire ugly history with Vanessa, Julian, the kitchen, the online photo 2 months later, my mother's excuses, my grandmother's comment about being more feminine. Trevor laughed, not cruelly. He thought I was being protective in a sweet, slightly overblown way. I'm a grown man, he said. I think I can handle your cousin. I wanted to believe him. I wanted, more than anything, for this one to be different because I loved him, and because some stubborn part of me still believed that if I just found the right man, someone secure enough, smart enough, decent enough, the pattern would finally break. It didn't break. It escalated. Christmas Eve, we were at my grandmother's house on Fulton Road, 22 people crammed into a living room meant for 12. Vanessa arrived in red, always something dramatic, always something that announced her before she spoke. Within the hour, she'd accidentally spilled wine down the front of her dress and asked Trevor, a doctor, a man whose entire professional identity was built on precision and calm competence, to help her get the stain out in the kitchen because he'd know what to do. He went. Of course he went. He was a doctor. Helping was reflexive for him, and that was exactly what she was counting on. They were gone 15 minutes. When they came back, Trevor's collar was slightly damp, and his expression had the glazed, faintly pleased look of a man who didn't yet understand what had just happened to him. Vanessa's dress was somehow drier than it should have been for someone who'd supposedly needed 15 minutes of stain treatment. We broke up in February. He gave me the same vague language Julian had. Things had shifted. He needed to figure some things out. In March, I saw him with another woman at a restaurant on Cleveland Avenue. It wasn't Vanessa, but it might as well have been because I understood by then that it was never really about the specific woman she pulled them toward afterward. It was about proving, to herself and to me, and to anyone watching, that she could take whatever I had. After Trevor, I stopped dating everything publicly. I stopped bringing anyone to holidays. I told my mother I was focusing on myself, which was true in the narrowest sense, and also a complete evasion of the real reason, which was that I refused to hand Vanessa one more piece of ammunition, one more man to add to the pattern she was building without ever once being held accountable for it. I dated in secret for almost 2 years, coffee dates in towns 40 minutes away, where nobody in my family would recognize me. Men I never introduced to anyone. It was lonely in a specific way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it, the loneliness of protecting yourself from your own family. I want to pause here and say something about my father, because he doesn't come up much in this story, and that's not an accident. My father, Gary, is a quiet man who has spent 30 years married to my mother, learning that the path of least resistance is silence. He never once told Vanessa's behavior was fine. He also never once told her it wasn't. When I brought it up to him directly, once, at his workbench in the garage, he said, "That's your mother's side of the family, sweetheart. I stay out of it." That was as close to an apology as I ever got from him. An apology for a crime he hadn't committed but had, for years, allowed to happen in his own house. It was during those 2 quiet years, the ones with no boyfriends and no holidays and no ammunition handed over, that I started volunteering with a prison literacy program through the county library system. I wanted something that had nothing to do with my family, something that felt like it mattered on its own terms. The program paired volunteers with incarcerated men and women working toward their GED or just wanting someone consistent to write to. I was assigned to a man named Michael Reyes, 34 years old, serving the tail end of a 7-year sentence at Grafton Correctional for a string of burglaries committed when he was 27, during a stretch of months when his mother was dying of ovarian cancer at Altman and he didn't have insurance to cover the difference between what Medicaid paid and what her hospice care actually cost. It wasn't an excuse, he told me flatly in his second letter, that plenty of people go through worse and don't break the law, that he'd made a choice and he owned it completely. But it was context, and he gave it to me without asking for sympathy, which is a distinction I came to understand mattered a great deal to him. We wrote letters for 8 months before he was released, usually 1 a week, sometimes 2. I want to be honest that I didn't expect much from it at first. I thought it would be a few polite exchanges and then it would taper off the way most volunteer correspondences do. Instead, Michael turned out to be one of the most honest people I had ever communicated with in my life, in prison or out of it. He didn't perform. He didn't flatter me. His handwriting was small and careful, like he'd learned somewhere that paper was a resource you didn't waste. When I mentioned Vanessa for the first time, almost as an aside in a letter about a bad week in March, he wrote back 4 pages later, in the middle of an unrelated paragraph about a GED practice exam, something I've thought about more times than I can count since. "Your cousin sounds miserable," he wrote, "and misery like that isn't about you. It's never really about the person it's aimed at. It's about what's missing in the person doing the aiming. I've met a lot of angry people in here, and the ones who stay angry forever are the ones who never once look at themselves. I'd bet money she's never looked." I didn't fully believe him at the time. It sounded too simple, too much like something you'd find printed on a motivational poster taped to a break room wall, but it planted something in me that took root slowly, over months, the way real understanding usually does. I wrote back and told him so, that it sounded like a fortune cookie, and he wrote back laughing at himself, admitting he'd probably read something similar in a psychology paperback from the prison library, and repurposed it badly. That was Michael too, willing to be a little ridiculous, willing to be caught being sincere and not flinch from it. Michael was released in October. We met for coffee at a place on Whipple Avenue 2 weeks later, the first time we'd ever seen each other in person, and we talked for 3 hours until the barista started stacking chairs around us. He noticed things before I said them out loud, that I flinched slightly whenever anyone mentioned family gatherings, that I'd trail off mid-sentence when I got close to something that still hurt. We started dating for real that same month. In November, my mother called and begged me to come to Thanksgiving. She'd done this every year since I'd started skipping, first with polite invitations, then with guilt, then with outright pleading, because my absence had apparently become its own kind of family drama, one my grandmother liked to comment on. I told Michael the whole ugly pattern, start to finish, sitting on his couch on a Tuesday night in mid-November, and braced myself the way I always did to go alone again, to sit through another dinner watching my family perform normalcy around a wound nobody would name. Michael said one word, "Take me." I told him he didn't understand. I told him Vanessa would eat him alive, that she was good at this in a way that had nothing to do with looks and everything to do with instinct, that she could read a room's weak point in about 4 seconds flat. Michael just looked at me and said that 7 years in a place like Grafton had taught him how to survive people far more dangerous than a woman in a cocktail dress with something to prove. I said yes. I don't fully know why, except that some part of me was tired of protecting a family that had never once protected me, and some other part of me wanted, badly, to see what would happen when the pattern met something it couldn't move. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up with my stomach in knots so tight I skipped breakfast entirely. Michael showed up at my apartment at 10 wearing a plain navy button-down and gray slacks, nothing flashy, nothing that announced anything about who he was or where he'd been. He looked like any guy you'd bring home to meet your parents. That was, I realized later, exactly the point. He wasn't performing toughness. He wasn't performing anything. "You ready?" he asked, and I told him no, honestly, and he laughed and said that was fair, and we drove to my parents' house on Route 62 with the radio low and my hands cold in my lap the entire 20 minutes. My mother answered the door in her Thanksgiving apron, the one with the cartoon turkey on it she's had since I was in middle school, and hugged Michael like she'd known him for years, which surprised me, until I remembered that my mother's hospitality reflex overrides almost everything else in her, including judgment. My father shook his hand firmly and asked if he followed football, and Michael said he did, and within 5 minutes they were talking about the Browns like old friends. My grandmother eyed him from her recliner but said nothing yet, which for her was practically a warm welcome. Then Vanessa walked in. She was 40 minutes late, as always, and she'd dressed for a different event entirely. A plunging black dress, heels that had no business on my mother's hardwood floors, hair and makeup done like she was walking a red carpet instead of eating turkey with people who'd known her since she was in diapers. She scanned the room the way she always did, cataloging, and her eyes landed on Michael, and I watched something in her face recalibrate in real time. "You must be Michael," she said, crossing the room before my mother could even finish the introduction. She held out her hand, and when he shook it, she held on a beat too long, the way she always did, the way that had worked on Julian and Trevor, and probably a dozen men before them I'd never even known about. "How did you two meet?" "Through a pen pal program," Michael said. Flat, even. No embellishment, no defensiveness, no attempt to dress it up or hide it. He said it the way you'd mention meeting someone at a grocery store. Vanessa blinked, clearly expecting either shame or a cover story, and got neither. She recovered fast, she always did, and laughed a little too loud, touching his arm as she said something about how sweet that was. Michael didn't pull away exactly. He just didn't lean in, which for a man being worked by Vanessa was its own kind of rebellion. Dinner started at 2. Vanessa sat across from us this time, not beside him, which I registered as strange until I understood she was building an angle, not making a move yet. She performed for the whole table. Loud stories about a trip to Cabo with a girlfriend she never named, a borrowed anecdote about a coworker that I was fairly sure she'd told before about a different coworker at a different job, a laugh that hit exactly on beat every time Michael glanced anywhere near her direction. She brought up a promotion she'd supposedly just gotten, details vague enough that I suspected, not for the first time, that it wasn't entirely true. She mentioned twice, unprompted, that she'd always wanted to visit Grafton. Actually, it's supposed to be beautiful countryside out there. A comment aimed squarely at Michael that landed on him like a pebble tossed at a wall, noted, ignored, gone. Nothing landed. He was polite. He complimented the stuffing twice and meant it both times. He asked my uncle about his fishing trip on Lake Erie in detail, specific enough that I understood he'd actually been listening, not performing interest the way most people do at family dinners. He did not once turn his full attention toward Vanessa the way every other man at that table eventually had, not even for the length of a sentence. And I watched her notice that and recalibrate again, the wheels turning visibly behind her eyes. She tried the chair thing around 4. "Michael, could you help me grab some folding chairs from the garage? I can never lift them myself." It was the oldest move in her book, the private errand pretext, the thing that had worked on Julian in the kitchen and Trevor with the wine stain. "Your dad can probably handle it," Michael said easily, not even looking up from his plate. "I'll stay in here, if that's all right." He shifted slightly closer to me under the table, not dramatically, just enough that I felt it, a small anchor. Vanessa tried a different angle next, one I hadn't seen her use before, which told me how badly she needed this to work. She turned to my grandmother, loud enough for the whole table to hear, and asked with theatrical innocence, "So, Michael, Grandma was just saying she read something about background checks for, people with records. Did you have to go through one of those for your job?" The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when someone has said the unsayable thing out loud on purpose. My grandmother, to her credit, or perhaps just her confusion, looked mildly baffled, since she hadn't said any such thing at all. Michael didn't flush, didn't stammer, didn't reach for me under the table like he needed rescuing. He set his fork down and looked at Vanessa directly, the first time all afternoon he'd given her his full attention. "I did," he said. "Facilities management runs one every year. I'm an open book about it. Happy to talk about it anytime, though I'm a little surprised it came up at Thanksgiving instead of, say, the weather." A small laugh went around the table, my uncle's the loudest, and I watched something in Vanessa's jaw tighten at being the one, for once, who'd made things awkward instead of everyone else. I had never, in 11 years, watched Vanessa fail this fast, this completely, at something she clearly considered a formality. I caught Jessica's eye across the table, my cousin Jessica, Vanessa's younger sister, quiet in the way people get when they've spent their whole life standing next to a supernova, and she gave me a look that I understood immediately. She saw it too. After dinner, plates cleared, the men parked in front of the television for the second half of a game nobody was really watching. Vanessa made her final move. She waited until my mother was in the kitchen wrapping leftovers, and my grandmother had drifted off in her recliner, timing it the way she always timed things, choosing the exact window where an audience existed but wasn't paying close attention. I watched her corner Michael by the drink table near the kitchen doorway, saw her lean in close, her hand flattening against his chest exactly the way it had against Julian's 11 years earlier, exactly the way it must have against Trevor's in that kitchen on Christmas Eve. Her voice dropped low, honeyed, the pitch she used only for this. I couldn't hear the words from across the room, only the cadence of it, practiced, syrupy, the same performance she'd given a dozen times before with a dozen different men who'd all eventually looked at me like I was the problem, like I was the one who couldn't hold on to anything good. Michael stepped back, not dramatically, just enough. He said something short, 4 or 5 words, and then he walked straight back across the room to me and sat down on the arm of the couch beside my chair like nothing had happened at all. My mother, passing by with a tray of pie, leaned down and whispered in my ear, "I like this one," with a small, surprised smile, as if she was only now updating a file she should have updated a decade earlier. In the car on the way home, I asked Michael what Vanessa had said to him. "She told me you were damaged," he said, eyes on the road, voice steady. "Said you were insecure, that you'd probably driven off every guy you'd ever dated because of it. Said I could do better." He paused at a red light. Then she gave me her number. "What did you say?" I told her I wasn't interested, and that she should probably work on being a decent person before she ruins anyone else's life. I cried the whole rest of the way home, not from sadness, from something else entirely. Something that had been coiled in my chest for 11 years, finally uncoiling. Michael reached over and held my hand at the next red light and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. A week later, my mother called, and I could hear from the first syllable that something had shifted. Vanessa had gone to her in tears, she said, telling her that I'd brought an ex-convict to Thanksgiving without warning anyone, that she'd felt unsafe the entire dinner, that she couldn't believe I would put the family at risk like that. My mother's voice had the particular strained quality it always got when she was trying to referee something she didn't actually understand. I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I'd spent 11 years defending myself to that family, and I was finished doing it for free. 3 weeks of silence followed. Texts from my mother calling me selfish, reckless, not thinking about how this looks. A single voicemail from my grandmother that I didn't listen to past the first 10 seconds. Her voice already climbing into the register she used when she wanted an apology she hadn't earned. I muted the group chain. I went to work. I saw Michael most weekends. I let the silence sit there, and for the first time in over a decade, I didn't fill it. Then my cousin Jessica asked to meet me in person. Her voice on the phone was tight, wrong, nothing like her usual easy cadence. We met at a coffee shop off Whipple, the same one, coincidentally, where Michael and I had first sat down together 2 months earlier. Jessica wrapped both hands around a coffee she never touched, and I watched her work up to whatever she'd driven 40 minutes to say. "Vanessa's been in therapy," she said finally. "Started a few months ago. Her therapist told her she needed to face what she's done, actually face it, apologize, own it, not the fake kind, the real kind. And she refused." Jessica's hands were shaking slightly around the cup. "She told the therapist you were the problem, that you'd always been jealous of her, that this was somehow all still about you. And then Thanksgiving happened, and something in her broke. Like actually broke, not dramatically broke, the way she usually does things. Quietly. Worse. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Worse how? She's been looking Michael up online. Old arrest photos, court records. She found an ex-girlfriend of his somehow, a woman named Kayla, and messaged her out of nowhere asking if Michael had ever gotten physical with her." Jessica pulled her phone out, hands still shaking, and turned the screen toward me. There were screenshots. Vanessa's messages to a stranger, fishing for anything that could be spun into a pattern. And Kayla's reply, short and confused, saying she'd dated Michael for 4 months, 2 years before his sentencing even started, and had nothing bad to say about him at all. "She's building a file," Jessica said. "Like actually building one. She showed me a folder on her laptop. She's talking about going to the police." "About what?" "She wants to file a report. Says Michael grabbed her wrist by the drink table and told her she'd regret crossing him. Says she felt scared for her safety the rest of the night. Scared enough that she didn't want to say anything until she'd processed it." Jessica looked like she might be sick. "She wants him sent back." She actually said that. Sent back. Like he's a package. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I asked Jessica why she was telling me this instead of just letting it happen, since she'd spent her whole life staying quiet while her sister did whatever she wanted. Jessica's eyes filled up fast, and she wiped at them angrily like she was furious at her own body for reacting. "Because I watched Priya cry in that bathroom when I was 14, she said, "and I never said anything. And I watched what happened to you with Julian and Trevor, and I never said anything then either, because saying something meant becoming the target instead of her. I'm done being quiet. I don't care what she does to me for this." I felt the floor tilt underneath me in a way I can only describe as physical, a lurch somewhere behind my ribs. Michael had finished his sentence, but he was still 18 months into a 3-year post-release control period, supervised by a parole officer named Ms. Whitfield, who he checked in with monthly. A new criminal accusation, even an unproven one, even one that never resulted in a formal charge, could be enough for Ms. Whitfield to flag a violation and send the whole matter in front of a judge who owed Michael nothing. I understood, sitting there in that coffee shop parking lot, that Vanessa wasn't just threatening to inconvenience him. She was threatening to unravel 18 months of good behavior, steady employment, and every quiet proof he'd built that he was not the worst thing he'd ever done. I thanked Jessica, hugged her tighter than I usually did, and walked straight to my car in the parking lot, hands barely steady enough to hold my phone as I called Michael. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything Jessica had said, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. The therapist, the refusal, the online searching, the ex-girlfriend, the threat of a false police report that could, given his record, send him back to a place he'd spent 7 years clawing his way out of. Michael went quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had a calm to it that unsettled me more than panic would have. "I had a feeling something like this might happen," he said. "How could you possibly have known that?" "Because I've met people like her before. Not exactly like her, but the shape of it. People who can't stand losing, especially not publicly, especially not in front of an audience they've spent years cultivating." He paused. "That's why I recorded it." "Recorded what?" "The whole conversation. By the drink table. Everything she said to me. The insults about you, the number, all of it. I had a feeling I might need it someday, so I turned my phone on and left it in my shirt pocket before dinner even started. I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up, engine off, hands finally steady, understanding that there was only one way to find out exactly how far Vanessa was willing to go, and that meant letting her make her next move before we made ours. She made it faster than either of us expected. 3 days after my conversation with Jessica, a Canton PD officer named Reyes, no relation to Michael, an unfortunate coincidence that made an already tense conversation slightly surreal, called Michael's cell phone directly, informing him that a report had been filed alleging he'd made verbal threats of violence at a private residence on Thanksgiving Day. The complainant, listed as Vanessa Doyle, had stated that Michael grabbed her wrist and told her she'd regret crossing him, language calculated for maximum effect against a man with a felony record. Michael didn't panic. He'd told me, back in that coffee shop conversation weeks earlier, that 7 years inside teaches you a particular kind of patience most people never develop, a willingness to let a situation play out fully before you spend your only good move. He asked Officer Reyes if he could come in voluntarily to give a statement, which surprised the officer enough that there was a pause on the line before he agreed. I drove Michael to the precinct on 3rd Street myself. My hands were shaking on the wheel the entire way. Some part of me still braced for the version of this story where the system does exactly what Vanessa was counting on it to do. Looks at a black man with a burglary conviction and a white woman's tearful accusation and doesn't ask a single further question. Michael was quiet in the passenger seat, jaw set, eyes forward, and somewhere around the second red light he reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, like he was reassuring me instead of the other way around. Inside, he gave his statement calmly, without embellishment, exactly the way he told Vanessa where he'd met me at Thanksgiving dinner. Then he asked if he could show them something on his phone. The recording was 11 minutes long, though the relevant portion was under 2. You could hear the ambient noise of the party in the background, my uncle's laugh, a football game commentary track, ice against glass. Then Vanessa's voice, closer to the microphone, unmistakably hers, telling Michael that I was damaged, that I was insecure, that he could do better, and then, unprompted, offering him her number. Michael's response was on the recording too, calm and clear. "I'm not interested. You should work on being a decent person before you ruin anyone else's life." At no point on the recording was there a raised voice, a threat, a hand on a wrist. There was, if anything, a woman working an angle and a man declining it politely. Officer Reyes listened to the full clip twice. He asked Michael to send him a copy through an official channel, thanked him for coming in voluntarily, and told him, in the careful language cops use when they know a case is about to collapse, that they'd be following up with the complainant. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Michael was still under supervision, and Michael told him about Ms. Whitfield, gave him her direct line without being asked twice. Officer Reyes made a note and said he'd reach out to her himself, proactively, to make clear the department did not consider the complaint credible. It was a small kindness, the kind that costs a cop nothing and means everything to the person on the other side of it. And I watched some of the tension leave Michael's shoulders for the first time in 3 days. Michael called Ms. Whitfield himself 2 days later anyway, not willing to leave something this important entirely in someone else's hands. I sat beside him on his couch while he made the call, listening to his half of it, watching his knee bounce under the coffee table the whole time. Ms. Whitfield, it turned out, had already gotten Officer Reyes's message. She told Michael the recording made the situation about as clean as these things ever get, and that she saw no basis for any action on her end. When he hung up, he sat very still for a moment, phone loose in his hand, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. We left the precinct that first day, and stood in the parking lot for a long moment before either of us said anything. When Michael finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly for the first time since this whole thing started. "I really thought I might be going back," he said. "For a second in there, I really thought that. I held on to him in that parking lot longer than either of us probably needed, but neither of us let go first. The fallout inside the family happened fast once it started, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly. It holds, and then it's simply gone. Jessica, who'd never once in her life gone against her sister publicly, told my mother everything. The therapist's warning, the refusal to apologize, the online searching, the false report, and worse, the fact that Vanessa had known it was false when she filed it, because she'd been standing right there when Michael declined her so plainly there was no room left for misinterpretation. My mother called me that same night. I expected the same tired defenses I'd been hearing my whole life. Vanessa didn't mean it. Vanessa's just going through something. Can't you two find a way to get along? Instead, for the first time in 11 years, my mother said something different. "I should have believed you a long time ago," she said. "About Julian, about Trevor, all of it. I told myself it wasn't that serious because it was easier than admitting what she was actually doing. I didn't know what to do with an apology, that old, that overdue. I cried on the phone with her, both of us actually, which had never happened before in my entire adult life. It didn't fix 11 years in a single phone call, but it was the first true thing my mother had said to me about Vanessa since I was 23 years old, and I understood, even through the tears, that it mattered. My grandmother did not apologize. My grandmother, when the full story reached her, filtered through my mother, softened as always, though there was no softening a false police report, said that Vanessa had always been dramatic, and that families work these things out privately. A sentence that, coming from a woman who'd told me 11 years earlier to be more feminine, landed with a particular kind of exhausted clarity. I understood finally, completely, that my grandmother was never going to change, and that the peace I needed wasn't going to come from her. Aunt Carol, Vanessa's mother, took her daughter's side entirely, which surprised no one who'd watched that family dynamic unfold over 3 decades. She called me twice, both times to tell me I was destroying her daughter's reputation, that a rumor like this could follow Vanessa for years, that I should think about the bigger picture instead of being so vindictive. I told her calmly that her daughter had tried to send an innocent man back to prison over a rejected phone number, and that if anyone was destroying Vanessa's reputation, it was Vanessa. Vanessa herself didn't call for over a month. When she finally did reach out, it wasn't to me directly. It was a long post on her social media, vague enough to avoid naming anyone, but obvious enough that everyone in the family knew exactly who it was about, describing herself as someone who'd been through a lot lately and was focusing on healing from toxic family dynamics. Jessica sent me a screenshot with a single row of exclamation points and nothing else. I didn't respond to the post. 2 days later, Vanessa sent me a text that read, "Only hope you're happy." I didn't respond to that either. There was nothing left to say to a person who, given the choice between honesty and winning, had chosen winning even when it meant fabricating a criminal accusation against a man who'd done nothing but decline her. The unexpected ally in all of this turned out to be Uncle Rick, Vanessa's own father. A quiet man I'd always assumed was simply as conflict avoidant as my own. He called me directly in January, the first time he'd ever called me about anything in my entire life, and told me he was sorry, not for Vanessa's behavior generally, which he admitted he'd never fully faced, but specifically for the police report, which he called a line she should never have crossed, and one I should have seen coming a long time before she crossed it. He told me he'd tried to talk to her about accountability more than once over the years, and always backed down when Carol got involved, defending Vanessa reflexively, turning any criticism into a referendum on Rick's own parenting. "I let your aunt run interference for too long," he said. "I'm not doing that anymore." He started showing up to the smaller family gatherings without Carol after that. A quiet, ongoing separation that nobody discussed directly, but everyone understood. There were financial and logistical complications too, the unglamorous kind nobody puts in the highlight reel of a story like this. Michael had to disclose the police contact, even though no charges were filed, during his next background recertification at work, since facilities management for a school district requires annual review and any law enforcement interaction, however unfounded, has to be documented. It meant 2 additional weeks of paperwork, a follow-up interview with HR, and a genuinely stressful stretch where he wasn't sure whether an unproven, ultimately unfiled complaint from a bitter cousin could cost him a job he'd worked hard to get and love. It didn't in the end. Officer Reyes's notes and the recording itself made the record about as favorable as an incident like that could be. But the 2 weeks of not knowing took a visible toll on him, a tightness in his shoulders that didn't fully leave until the recertification cleared. I paid for a lawyer's consultation out of pocket, $400 for an hour with a family law attorney named Patricia Voss, just to understand what our options were if Vanessa escalated further, whether we needed a formal cease and desist regarding the online messaging to Kayla, whether Michael had any civil recourse for the false report, even without pursuing criminal charges. Patricia walked us through the practical costs of each path, months of filings, the emotional toll of depositions, the real possibility that a civil suit would simply give Vanessa another stage to perform victimhood on, this time in front of a judge instead of a dinner table. In the end, we didn't pursue anything further. Patricia's advice, delivered over coffee in her office on Market Avenue, was blunt. The best outcome here isn't more litigation, it's distance. We took her advice, and I've never once regretted the $400 it cost to hear a stranger say, with total clarity, the thing I already suspected but needed someone outside the family to confirm. The legal complications dragged on longer than any of us expected. Filing a false police report is a crime in Ohio, and Michael, with the recording in hand and Officer Reyes's own notes corroborating the discrepancy, had every right to pursue charges against Vanessa. He debated it for almost 2 weeks. I remember sitting with him at his kitchen table, a legal pad between us, weighing what pursuing it would cost him. More court dates, more time inside a system that had already taken 7 years from him, more exposure to a process that had never once been kind to him, against what letting it go would mean, which was that Vanessa would walk away from a false accusation with nothing but a warning and a story she'd probably eventually rewrite to cast herself as the victim. In the end, he decided not to press charges, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a clear-eyed calculation that he described to me plainly. I've already given that system 7 years. I'm not giving it one more day over her. The department issued Vanessa a formal formal warning regarding the filing of a false report, which would sit quietly in a file somewhere, unlikely to ever surface again unless she did something similarly reckless in the future. It wasn't justice in the dramatic sense the internet usually wants. It was smaller than that and quieter, and I understood by then that Michael had earned the right to decide what kind of ending he wanted, even if it wasn't the one I might have chosen for him. There was a strange grief buried in all of it that took me months to name. I mourned quietly, the cousin I might have had if any of this had gone differently. If Vanessa had ever once, at any point across 2 decades, chosen honesty over winning, chosen me over an audience. I remembered small things from our childhood that had nothing to do with any of this. Her teaching me to French braid my hair in my grandmother's bathroom when I was 9, standing behind me at the mirror, patient in a way she almost never was about anything else. Both of us laughing until we couldn't breathe at a home video from a family trip to Myrtle Beach, the summer I was 10, where our fathers had gotten sunburned trying to fly a kite and spent the whole drive home complaining about it in exactly the same whiny voice, which we imitated back at them for the rest of the trip. A Christmas morning when we were maybe 7 and 8 and we'd built a blanket fort in her living room using every cushion in the house, and stayed in it with a flashlight and a bag of pretzels until our mothers made us come out for dinner, both of us furious at being interrupted. I found an old photo a few months after the police report collapsed, buried in a box in my parents' attic. The two of us maybe 6 and 7, matching Easter dresses, arms around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed and grinning at whoever was holding the camera. I sat on the attic floor with that photo for a long time. That cousin existed once, briefly, before whatever broke in her broke all the way, before the world started telling her that being pretty and winning were the only currencies that mattered, before nobody in our family ever once told her no. I let myself grieve her specifically, separately from the woman she'd become, because pretending she'd never existed at all felt like its own kind of dishonesty, and because grief, I was learning, doesn't require the person you're grieving to be dead. Sometimes it just requires them to be gone in every way that matters. Vanessa made one more move that spring, the kind of desperate final gesture that, looking back, told me more about her than anything else in this entire story. She showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Sunday in April. No call ahead, no text, just her standing on my doorstep in jeans and a sweatshirt, the most understated I'd seen her dressed in a decade. She said she wanted to apologize. I let her in, mostly out of shock, and made tea neither of us drank. The apology, when it came, wasn't really an apology. It was a performance of one, the same instinct that had run her whole life, just recalibrated for a smaller audience. I know I've made mistakes, she said, but you have to understand. Growing up in Grandma's shadow of expectations was hard for me too. I was never allowed to just be normal. I had to be the pretty one, the fun one. Do you know what that does to a person? She talked for 20 minutes about her own childhood, her own pressures, working her way toward the police report only at the very end, and even then she framed it as something that had gotten out of hand rather than something she'd deliberately constructed. She never once said Michael's name during the entire visit. She never once asked how he was doing, whether the parole complication had resolved, whether the job recertification had gone through okay. It wasn't an apology to us. It was a bid to be forgiven without having to fully look at what she'd done. I told her as gently as I could manage that I appreciated her coming, and that I didn't think we were ready to rebuild anything, and that ready might be a long time coming, if it came at all. She left more coldly than she'd arrived, the mask sliding back into place somewhere around my doorway, and I never heard from her directly again after that. Jessica told me later, secondhand, that Vanessa had told their mother the visit hadn't gone how she wanted, as if my response had been the failure, rather than her own inability to reckon with what she'd done. My father, uncharacteristically, was the one who said something that stuck with me most in those weeks. We were in the garage again, him at his workbench, me sitting on an overturned bucket the way I had as a kid. I should have said something a long time ago, he said, not looking up from whatever he was fixing. I told myself staying quiet was the same as staying neutral. It wasn't. I'm sorry. It wasn't much. It was more than he'd ever given me before, and I took it. There was one more scene that mattered, one that happened in February at my mother's house, a smaller gathering for my father's birthday that Vanessa attended without knowing Jessica had already told my mother everything. My mother, who I'd never once in my life seen confront Vanessa directly about anything, set down a serving spoon in the middle of dinner and asked her, in front of Aunt Carol, Uncle Rick, and my grandmother, whether it was true that she'd filed a police report she knew to be false. The table went silent in a way I'd never experienced at that table before. Vanessa's face did something complicated, a flicker of the old performance, the wounded recalibration she always did, before she landed on indignation. I felt unsafe, she said. I'm allowed to feel unsafe. You told him he'd regret crossing you, and that he grabbed your wrist, my mother said, her voice even, but her hands visibly shaking around her napkin. There's a recording, Vanessa. We've all heard it now. Jessica played it for me. There's no wrist. There's no threat. There's you asking a man for his attention, and him saying no, and you deciding to try to send him back to prison for it. My grandmother, for the first time in this entire saga, said nothing in Vanessa's defense. She just looked at her granddaughter with an expression I'd never seen her wear, something between confusion and the first flicker of real disappointment. Vanessa looked around the table, at Rick's stone face, at my mother's shaking hands, at Jessica staring hard at her plate, at my grandmother's silence, and understood, I think for the first time in her life, that the room wasn't going to perform perform for her this time. She stood up, said something about how nobody understood what she'd actually been going through, and left before dessert. Aunt Carol followed her out a few minutes later, already composing the defense she'd repeat for the next year. Nobody else got up. Nobody else went after her. That was the moment, more than the police station, more than the recording itself, that I understood something had actually shifted. Not because Vanessa had changed, she never did, but because for the first time in over a decade, the room had finally seen her clearly, and she hadn't been able to talk her way back out of it. The rest of the family split, unevenly, the way families do. My Uncle Rick, Vanessa's father, stopped attending gatherings where the topic came up at all, which was its own kind of statement, and started building the quieter, separate relationship with me and Jessica that would eventually bring him to my wedding without his wife. Aunt Carol stayed loyal to her daughter, loudly and without nuance, at every family function for the following year, repeating the same 3 grievances at anyone who'd listen, that I'd ambushed the family with Michael, that the recording was somehow taken out of context, that Jessica had betrayed her own sister, until eventually the loudness of it made even the people who'd been neutral, my mother's cousin Rhonda among them, start drifting away from her too. By the following Thanksgiving, Carol was eating dinner at a restaurant alone with Vanessa, rather than face a table that no longer performed sympathy for her on command. Jessica and I grew closer than we'd ever been, meeting for coffee every few weeks at first, then settling into an easy, regular rhythm neither of us had to think about anymore. Both of us spent those months slowly untangling what it meant to have grown up in the shadow of someone the whole family had agreed, tacitly, never to hold accountable, and what it cost each of us differently. Me and the men I lost, her and the sister she'd never really had, both of us in the version of ourselves we might have become if we hadn't spent our whole childhoods managing around someone else's need to win. Michael and I got married 18 months later, in a small ceremony at a park along the Nickel Plate Trail. 40 guests, no formal dinner, just sandwiches and a folding table of lemonade. Vanessa was not invited. My mother came and cried through most of the ceremony and hugged Michael afterward longer than she'd ever hugged any boyfriend of mine before him. My grandmother came too, mostly I suspect, because not coming would have generated more gossip than coming did, and she said nothing about Michael's past the entire day, which for her was as close to an olive branch as she was capable of offering. Uncle Rick came alone, without Carol, and gave a small, awkward toast about second chances that made my mother cry harder. Amanda was my maid of honor. In her toast, she told the story of that kitchen table conversation years earlier, the wine and the pointed question about Derek, though she left the family's uglier details out of it for the sake of the room. I watched her spend a decade thinking the problem was finding the right man, she said, raising her glass. Turns out the problem was never the men at all. Jessica cried through the whole toast, sitting beside my mother, the two of them leaning into each other in a way I'd never once seen them do before that year. I think about the version of me who sat at that Thanksgiving table 11 years ago, 23 years old, holding a bowl of green beans, watching my boyfriend's arm get touched by a cousin who'd already decided, before the appetizers were even out, that she was entitled to whatever I had. I wish I could tell her it gets better, though better undersells what actually happened, which is that it required me to stop asking a broken system to fix itself and start building something new entirely. One honest relationship, one honest conversation, one honest cousin at a time. I live now in a small house off Apple Grove Street with Michael, who works in facilities management for the school district and coaches a rec league basketball team on Saturdays. A version of stability neither of us takes for granted, given what it cost us both to arrive here. His parole period ended 11 months ago, quietly, with no ceremony beyond a final check-in with Ms. Whitfield and a handshake he described to me afterward like it was the biggest thing that had happened to him all year, which I think it was. We still go to some family functions, my mother's mostly, the smaller ones, the ones where I know exactly who'll be in the room before I walk in the door. We don't go to my grandmother's anymore, not out of anger exactly, but because peace, real peace, sometimes means choosing which rooms you're willing to sit in. Jessica comes over most Sundays now. She and Amanda get along better than I expected, and the three of us have a standing dinner once a month that started as a way to check in on each other and has slowly become one of the steadiest things in my life. My mother calls every week, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask carefully how Michael's doing, in a tone that still carries a trace of the guilt she's never fully put down. My father fixed the brakes on Michael's truck last spring without being asked, which is, in the language my father speaks, a love letter. I don't know what happened to Vanessa. Not really. Not anymore. Jessica mentions her occasionally. A new job in Columbus. A relationship that apparently ended badly last winter. A general sense from a distance of someone still running the same play in rooms further and further from the ones that used to applaud her for it. I don't feel triumphant hearing it. I feel something closer to the specific sadness of watching a house you used to live in fall slowly into disrepair from a road you no longer drive down. I heard, secondhand, that she'd told a new co-worker once that she used to be close with her cousin before family stuff got complicated, a sentence so small and so revisionist that I almost laughed when Jessica repeated it to me, complicated, as if a false police report were weather too, something that had simply happened to both of us, rather than something she'd built with her own two hands out of spite and a rejected phone number. Some nights still, I think about that photo from the attic, the two little girls in matching Easter dresses, and I let myself feel the whole shape of it, the loss, the relief, the small mercy of finally being believed by the people girl who should have believed me a decade sooner. Grief and peace turned out to be roommates, not opposites. I didn't know that until I lived it. Here's the thing I understand now that I didn't at 23. The problem was never really that Vanessa found my boyfriends attractive. The problem was a family that had decided, generations back, that some people's comfort mattered more than other people's pain, and that keeping the peace meant asking the person being hurt to simply hurt more quietly. I spent over a decade thinking the solution was finding a man secure enough to withstand her. The actual solution was refusing to sit at a table that had never once protected me, and building a different table entirely with people who would. I think about my grandmother sometimes, the woman who told a 23-year-old to be more feminine while eating pie, and I understand now that she wasn't a villain exactly, just a woman who'd spent her whole life mistaking peace for the absence of conflict, never once understanding that the two things aren't the same. Some peace is real, some peace is just silence wearing a nicer outfit. It took me until I was almost 30 to learn the difference, and I don't resent the years it took because I don't think I could have learned it any faster than I did. Some lessons only take root at the exact pace grief allows them to. Vanessa's world didn't fall apart in one dramatic evening, the way these stories sometimes promise. It fell apart slowly, the way most consequences actually arrive. A failed police report, a sister who finally told the truth, a mother who stopped making excuses, an aunt who stayed loyal to a lie until loyalty itself became a kind of exile. What fell apart wasn't a single Thanksgiving. It was the illusion held together for 2 decades by everyone's silence, that she could take whatever she wanted and never once be asked to answer for it. I brought an ex-convict to Thanksgiving because I was tired, and because some reckless, hopeful part of me wanted to see what would happen when the pattern finally met something it couldn't move. What I found instead was a man who'd already survived worse than my cousin, who didn't need me to protect him, who protected himself with nothing more than a recording and the simple, radical act of telling the truth when asked. I didn't get a fairy tale ending. I got something better and sadder and more honest than that. A family cut roughly in half, a cousin I'll probably never speak to again, and a grief for the relationship we might have had if she'd ever once chosen me over her own reflection. Some things you lose on purpose because keeping them costs more than losing them ever will. I know that now. I didn't know it at 23, holding that bowl of green beans, watching her hand land on someone else's chest for the first of what would be many times. I know it now, and some days that knowledge feels like peace, and some days it just feels like the specific, quiet ache of finally understanding what you were never going to get.